little housekeeping. Thanks as always, to our continuing education sponsor, Greater Winston-Salem, Inc. Thank you to them very much for helping us put these on. Little housekeeping. Next week, we like to tease ahead. 4 o'clock, we're going to do a seminar on REMIs, remote broadcasts. I know a lot of people have expressed interest since if we ever get back to sports, a lot of the broadcasts, if not the majority of them, will be done remotely from perhaps homes or studios or broadcast trucks. So we're going to do one on that next week. And without further ado, we will get rolling. Just want to warn everybody, we are recording this. It is not a newscast, so we can edit things out if we have to. That just makes more work for me, so I prefer not to. So Jay, watch that mouth. Anyway, I'd like to introduce our 3 panelists, Jay Harris, LaChina Robinson, and Lonnae O'Neal. I'm not going to give everybody's bio because the first thing I want to do is ask you about your background, your path to where you are now, and if personally and or professionally you have experienced racism along the way. So let's start out with Lonnae, who I have never met, but we did talk on the phone the other day. And since you're the new person on the block, I'm going to start with you.
I am
Lonnae,
the new.
welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be part of this discussion. So I'm Lonnae O'Neal, and I come to sports journalism by way of a really untraditional background. I had 2 decades at the Washington Post where I was a feature writer, and I wrote about arts and museums. I wrote about, I wrote obituaries. I wrote all around the paper, never including sports, mind you. But I did write a lot of race and culture. And so that's how I ended up at the Undefeated, which is at the intersection of race, sports, and culture. And so this notion of have I experienced racism? So the short answer is yes, it's ambient. Everyone has, right? It's in the air. It's so everywhere and so ambient that it's invisible. So that would take a lot of unpacking, but that's the short answer.
And your path, where have you worked on your way to where you are?
I worked at the Washington Post and the Undefeated. I started at the Washington Post.
Ah, okay.
I did. When I left, I was a columnist, and the Undefeated was constituted, as I said, to be at the intersection of race, sports, and culture. And I had spent a majority of my career as a general assignments writer. So because I wrote a lot of race and because I wrote a lot of culture, the sports part, I ended up learning in the doing, right? Story by story, game by game, interview by interview. And so I just used the same muscles that I had used at the Post. And so far that's worked out for me.
And you and I talked the other day, sports, we're all really news reporters. Sports just happens to be our beat.
Right.
But,
right.
If you're a reporter, you're a reporter.
Exactly. As long as nobody asks me about that big game in 2001, I'm good.
Thank you.
You can Google it.
Jay, go ahead.
Siri.
Yeah, there you go. Jay, your path. Oh, you're muted there, Jay.
I thought I unmuted myself. I apologize. I thought I muted and unmuted myself. It's my first Zoom. I don't know what I'm doing. Radio news in Virginia, radio news in Pittsburgh, television news in Pittsburgh, ESPN. That's my path.
Racism for you, obviously, as Lonnae said, it's ambient. When did you first experience? When was your first experience with it?
Oh man, I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I really didn't experience much when I was in North Carolina. To be honest with you, I didn't personally. Some of my friends did. I think our first experience in racism was when we moved to Pittsburgh, and my wife and I called on an apartment. And the woman said, hey, come over and check out the place. And we went over to check out the place. And she said, no, there's no apartment here. After we knocked on the door, we said, we just talked to you 20 minutes ago. You said there was an apartment. No, there's no apartment. You can't, no, bye. So, I mean, I can't for sure say it's because we're brown, But the fact that there was an apartment when we were on the phone, and then there was no apartment when we were in front of her, so I'm guessing. I'm just guessing. I don't know.
LaChina,
We have some
I'm
money.
sorry,
I'm just guessing.
LaChina, your path? Unmute.
You're muted.
Dang it, my bad.
All these Zoom rookies.
I've been saying for the last 3 months, like, I'm not gonna get caught on mute. And of course it happens to me. Dave and I crossed paths when I was a student athlete. I played basketball at Wake Forest. Started my career in athletic administration, working at the ACC office and then Georgia Tech. Made a pivot into broadcasting in my late 20s. I've worked for, there's one thing I say about Wikipedia is that most of it is not true, except for the fact that I've probably worked for about 20 networks. That's accurate. But right now I'm being employed by ESPN, specifically for the ACC network. And I just do want to say that everything that I will share on this Zoom is a combination of my experiences during my career across the board, even going back to working in athletic administration, but I will try to keep it specific to sports broadcasting. But as far as racism, I thought about it in terms of this profession more specifically. And these are 3 ways that I can share that I feel like I've experienced racism most often. Number 1 is isolation. Not being invited to included in meetings or social gatherings for work where it was clear that I was left off for inexplicable reasons. Microaggressions, which that's a term I know a lot of people are using. I looked up a couple of different definitions and kind of landed on this one that I'll share. The everyday slights, indignities, put downs, and insults that people of color, women, LGBT populations, or those who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions with people. What microaggressions have looked like in my career is the assumption, for example, that if there's a rapper at the game, that I must know who it is. Or if I wear braids, they make reference to some type of vacation hairdo, as though this is not an everyday way of wearing my hair. You see, I've got some twists in right now. The last form of racism I think I experience most often is just basically being flat out told that there's been limited space for the Black voice. I was actually told once that I wasn't needed for a particular show because they already had a minority voice. So those are 3 ways that I would say I most often experience racism, or I have in my career.
Wow.
Either Lonnae or Jay, coming up in the business in your career, have you had to deal with it within the walls of where you work? And if so, have you brought it to superiors' attention, and what was the result of that?
For me, because I've only worked a couple of places, and certainly overtly in the workplace, I'm not going to experience something like what Jay experienced. I'm saddened but not shocked that LaChina was told to her face that there was no space for her. I haven't been told there was no space for me, but I've certainly felt the times when there was no space for me. If you go into a room and nobody there looks like you, no one is interested in your opinion, no one asks you anything, and the agenda moves on without anything that's on your mind or that you think is important, that's what I meant by ambient. It's everywhere. You're not going to raise your hand and say, hey, such and such, this is racist, or this is, and most people are not intending to be. It is simply a structure that perpetuates without your input, and without you necessarily having to be a bad person. But the net effect is this kind of soul crushing at times, lack of seeing yourself or hearing your concerns voiced, or being able to go to someone and take an idea that might be embryonic just at the beginning, but there's not enough oxygen in the room. There's not enough people who you won't have to translate to be able to get this idea, into fruition. And so that's been more my experience at times. Sometimes that's more acute than others, but it's the day after day having to do layers of translation that can kind of wear on you.
Jay, have you ever been held back from a promotion because of the color of your skin?
No, I don't believe that has ever happened to me. I believe that I haven't gotten jobs outside of where I was because of the color of my skin. If I, depending on the market, when I was doing news, if I applied for a position and the co-anchor or the female co-anchor specifically was Black, I probably wouldn't go get that job because two Black people on the same set, no. And this was in the 90s. So I've had that. But you just kind of deal with it. You learn where to go. You learn who you can talk to, who you can trust, and you just kind of navigate that space. And you have to let it roll off your back. You can't let it crush you because you have things to do. You have a life to live. You have a job to do. So you have to keep going.
It almost ends up being like another language, doesn't it? Like you got moves like a running back.
Yeah.
Right?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah. Bobbing and weaving like a boxer.
Exactly. Feint and dodge and keep it moving.
How much more prevalent, if so, racism when you started in your career to now? Any of the three of you or all of you?
That's a good question. Our jobs mirror society. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, because we live in society and we are human beings navigating our way through this society. So it still exists in greater society. I think within our profession, depending on where you are, you have people who are more understanding and more willing to try and work themselves out of old habits than others. I have a friend of mine who's a reporter in the city who wanted to cover the protests and wasn't allowed. They decided her voice wasn't necessary, but her voice was the only brown voice that was covering the riot. So I found that kind of hilarious. They'd rather have the pretty white girl cover the protests. So and that's a horrible place for my friend to be. At ESPN, I give my folks a lot of credit. We had a staff meeting the other week, and there was a lot of heartfelt talk, tears, empathy. We're going to work on this, and we're going to get better. So it just depends on where you are and who you're dealing with.
I think I'm going to co-sign what Jay said in terms of it depends on where you are. Certainly at the Washington Post, the emphasis is on good journalism, right? And so there is always an aha moment. There's always a recognition. There always comes a point, usually after a tipping point in society, when you realize from leaving aside just the sort of fairness argument and the sort of humanity of it from a strictly good reporting standpoint, right? You are missing stories if you do not have whatever the plural of eyes, are on a particular phenomena. You're missing the point and missing stories if you don't have someone who can look at what everybody else is looking at, see it from a different angle, be able to translate that to a wider audience in a way that makes it universal, right? You're simply missing that story, and another newsroom that has that capacity is going to get it, right? You only get that with a diversity of voices, right? If you imagine sort of a bilingualism, then, Black folks, we know, our cultural specificities, and we know the mainstream culture, right? Other folks have to have that same or develop that same sort of faculty to be able to go into different spaces and hear different voices, see different stories, and hire different people. And recognize that if you are fielding a team, you need to have a lot of different positions covered. And just having one type of reporter is not going to get it for you. It wasn't going to get it before, so you miss stories, but it's especially not going to help you moving forward.
There has to be a proactivity, not just a reactivity, correct?
If you want to get ahead of the story instead of following everybody else who's beating you.
As you might be able to see on our screen here, the vast majority of the people who are attending are white faces or lighter brown. I submit we're all brown, just different shades. How can we as white reporters or whatever position we hold, when we deal with Black athletes or athletes of color, and not get into some of the same tropes, if you will, or assumptions? What's maybe a good rule or a couple of rules that we should keep in our mind?
LaChina, you want to start as the former athlete? Because I know you've had people put microphones in your face and just say crazy stuff.
I did that one a few times.
I would just say start with your life. Like, don't even think about it from the scope of being a white journalist, but look at the diversity of your overall life, and that will be the scope into which you handle Black athletes. You know, one statistic that I heard that stood out to me recently was, I'm gonna read this here: 40% of American schools are either 90% white or 90% Black. And what that means to me is there's a good chance that some of the white journalists you're referring to, Dave, may be in positions where they haven't spent a lot of time around Black people, Black men and women, right? And so I think that's a challenge in general, is to look at your life, who you're around, who's in your inner circle. I actually have a graphic that I will share with some valuable information, but I think it comes with first diversifying your life, because if you grow up in a school, say you were one of those that, you know, just did not see, or you weren't around minorities growing up, your view is what maybe you see on television. So it may be, you know, a criminal, or we're not seeing Black faces on television as often as we should. So maybe you don't even know what to make when it's your time to be one-on-one with a Black athlete. So I think it just comes with normalizing the existence of Black people in your life, and sitting down and having lunch with your Black colleague, and thinking about the companies where you spend your money, and looking in your community and spaces where your kids are. Like, are you endorsing diversity where you are, but also are you having interactions with diverse people? Mm-hmm. I think it definitely starts there. So once you're able to see and dispel some of the built-in prejudice that exists in some people from a very young age, and once you can counter what you've seen from Black people maybe growing up in limited intake, and you can really expand, I think that will impact eventually how you cover the Black athlete. But I think you check yourself by saying, okay, if the Black athlete just scored, you know, so-and-so just scored 30 points, and I'm thinking about not interviewing him, but instead interviewing the white point guard, because he might, you know, just give us a better soundbite, or I just feel more comfortable with him than maybe that Black athlete that may be more deserving of that interview. Those are the questions or ways I think you can sometimes check your bias. But, you know, I just think immersing yourself in a diverse community is where it starts, even outside of sports journalism.
I think that's right, LaChina, absolutely. And I think it also starts with humility, right? And so exactly what you're saying, if you feel like you already are an authority on something, or you already have a body of knowledge that's going to carry you, do you have the humility to go into a situation where you're uncomfortable and not center your voice, but rather listen, right? And pick up on things that you hadn't known. A lot of reporting is nuance, right? The broad strokes of a story might be there, but are you able to see around corners? And so I think LaChina is right. That comes from exposure, right? Not otherizing, just being there, listening, and taking note of what it is that you don't know.
Yeah, and do your research.
Mm.
I'll go back to my days as a general assignment reporter. I could get whatever story on any day. I'd go cover the city hall, the school board, city government. I have to be an instant expert, so I'd have to do my research. I had to cover a guy, some Klan leader who was making terroristic threats against some folks that were on his land. I've never been in the Klan, but I still had to cover the guy, and I wasn't thinking, ooh, Klan. I was thinking, what's the story? He's making these threats. Okay, let me do some research on the story, research on the threats, research on what he said. I didn't care who he was. It didn't matter because I'm covering the story. And if you do your research on your story and not focus on if it's a race story, you'll do fine. And if you make a mistake, if you say something crazy, more often than not, if you do it with the humility that Lonnae was talking about, and if you do it with the attitude of I'm really trying to do a good job, chances are no one's going to jump on you. They're going to appreciate the fact that you're trying.
Unless it's Bill Belichick.
Well, Bill Belichick will just do that to everybody.
That's exactly. Couple of related questions here. How can you navigate the challenge of taking a stand when people tell you you're betraying journalistic integrity? You just kind of touched on that, Jay. And how do you let people know that standing for a human rights issue does not taint that objectivity?
Everybody comes. Go ahead, Jay.
No. You go ahead. You go ahead.
I had to do a story on the federal duck stamp program, by the way, Jay. It wasn't quite the Klan, but I had to do it in a day. And I promise you I've never been duck hunting. So there you go. We all come to reporting with subjectivities, right? And with biases and with our own lens. You don't eliminate that, but you do the reporting so that whatever your perspective is informed, right? It's when people opine, when they don't have receipts, right? When they're not supporting what they say, when they haven't done enough reporting, haven't gone deep enough, that these things feel glaring and obvious and insulting. So exactly, sort of what Jay said, you do your research, and in terms of people wondering or worried about whether you take a stand, you go where the reporting takes you. If I'm doing a story and I'm writing about masks, which is a hot topic, right, in the COVID pandemic, right, and it has become political. Well, there you go. That's right.
Very good. LaChina?
Wait, do I have one?
There you go.
Mine is less. I have this one.
Yeah.
But you go where the science tells you to go, and you write that. And you write that with the support of the data and the authorities and the officials that you've talked to. So when you're accused of, subjectivity and all of that kind of stuff in your reporting, you back it up with receipts. Dave, when you're talking about taking a stand, do you mean, explain a little bit more? Something separate from the reporting?
Right. I think, maybe my guess is it's somebody who was asking about, say, Black Lives Matter, that's the topic on the table. You feel a certain way. How do you balance that with doing, if that's your story? And obviously we may or may not be in sports right here, but how do you balance the way you feel with whatever the story may be?
I think, honestly, a good journalist really doesn't have to answer that question. And maybe that sounds like a little journalistic elitist of me, but you go into a story to tell the story.
Right.
If you bring your biases to a particular story, like Black Lives Matter. If I'm not on that story, I might go, absolutely, Black Lives Matter. but I'm on a story, and depending on what that story is, that's the story I have to do today. If I'm covering a protest, if I talk to the organizers, and even if there's some counter protesters, I go talk to them too. And I tell the full story of the event. It doesn't matter what I think. I'm not interviewing myself. It's not me. I'm not the story. So whatever's inside me just sits aside while I'm on the job. Then afterwards, I deal with it.
Lonnae, China?
I mean, I think they pretty much covered it. My job is a little different because I am usually asked her opinion. Mm-hmm. And so, again, with us all coming with our own lens, our own life experiences, it is often for me, not only looking at a story, but giving my perspective, which will be connected in most situations to how I feel. I mean, it's your opinion and how you feel are the same thing. So it's a little bit different for me, but I agree with Lonnae and Jay in that if you were reporting and you're supposed to be objective, you follow the facts.
Absolutely. So for both of them, for LaChina and Jay, if I'm reporting a story, that's one thing. I do exactly what, Jay said. Black lives matter tremendously to me. They're everybody I love in my life. They're all my family, all my parents and people around me. When I am writing a story, I'm entrusted by my organization to go out and get the story. I don't ask white reporters, nor would they answer to that. Well, how do you cover this, the circuit court because it's so white, it is. And so you assume that they just do the job that they're charged with reporting. I left the Post as a columnist though. So like LaChina, I had an opinion. And I wrote about what I thought because that was my job. But that was also something I supported by informing myself. Whether or not it showed up in the lines, it was an informed opinion.
All right. What advice, suggestions do you have for media outlets who want to cover these meaningful topics and provide athletes and coaches with a proper forum for meaningful discussion without chasing down stories or headlines and making it more about the outlet than the issues?
Whoa, could you ask that again?
Yeah. I probably should have asked for clarification. If it's somebody who's on this call who asked this question, I'm sorry, I just put them all together without names. If you want to.
I actually asked that question, and I can clarify if you'd like.
Hey,
yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
Sure. I think, as somebody that manages I oversee Mile Split, which is a high school track and field network of websites. And, most of, our team are, white former middle distance runners. And, one of the things that we've wrestled with editorially is, how do we strike the balance between giving, African-American athletes and coaches that we cover, the platform to speak, on these meaningful topics without suddenly running out and, interviewing every single, African-American athlete we can come across, which to me comes across as disingenuous and makes it more about us chasing headlines than, actually providing athletes a platform to speak.
On which particular stories are you?
Just anything involving racial injustice.
Okay.
And some of the things that, are, we're talking about here today.
Okay. Ask the white people. Because race isn't just a black thing. Ask the white people, what do you think about this? And get them on and see what they say. And then go in turn, ask the black people. But just ask everybody. Just don't ask black people.
And I will say too, Joe, to add to that, Jay, that I think the story will reveal itself, right? So it's not like you have to go necessarily chase down a story on Black Lives Matter if you feel like that's not the primary function of your newspaper or your publication, but maybe you are covering an event and an athlete that you're covering has on a t-shirt, or maybe you've been reading quotes from a coach over the last couple of weeks and that's the thing that they've been constantly talking about. or maybe they said something about it that stood out to you. So again, it goes back to your journalistic instinct of not ignoring the story, right? And which allows you then to open your eyes and see what's happening and approach that story or that situation in a way that you would any other lead or any other topic of interest.
I think, right, absolutely. What LaChina is talking about is part of what I think of as just sort of getting bigger in your understanding of what your job is. So make it a habit and a practice to know, to have your own literacy on these issues so that when they pop, you're not starting from scratch. And when they die down, you're not putting them away, because what American history teaches us is that they're always going to pop. There's always going to be a situation where you're going to have to pivot, right? And if you are monitoring folks' social media and having conversations with them, and you find out these things that they care about, because after they leave the court or the field or the pool or whatever arena, they go back home to a family and a community that they respond to and that they are responsive to. So those issues are going to be on their minds. So why don't you have conversations with them before you need to chase them on deadline, and then that's when it feels disingenuous because you never showed any interest in it before. If you make it part of a habit and a practice of your reporting, then it happens more seamlessly. And as Jay was saying, folks will give you the benefit of the doubt. If you act in good faith, that telegraphs, just like being desperate, never having thought about it before, needing to chase somebody to get this quote, that telegraphs too.
There's been a lot of talk recently about white people need to do your homework. I watched a podcast yesterday, Ed Berliner's Man in the Arena podcast. He had former NFL player Keith Sims and former Miami news anchor Ed Odell. I want to read you a quote from Keith Sims. He said, "We are the minority in this country. We're not in power. We can't change it on our own. We need enough white people and enough white folks in power who agree with us that change needs to happen." Perfect, right?
Because we're exhausted. We can't carry all this. It's a national problem. If we're carrying all of it, it doesn't get the kind of progress we make to be a nation that lives up to our ideals doesn't get met. B, you can't be allergic to being uncomfortable. You can't. So we carry all of it, or have carried it, because there was no safe space for us not to. So what you're seeing is, all kinds of reckonings and tipping points are happening, and enough people are saying, hey, we want some of that too, and we're ready for it. If you are actually ready for it, that means ready to be uncomfortable, ready to not just make it all about you, center you, be in your feelings, because they're not more important than our lives, right? And sort of what's happening in the nation. And so if you want to do that work, you have to sort of square up your shoulders and be ready for that. And so doing your homework just means we're exhausted. It's been a pandemic. A lot of folks been on social media talking about they learned how to make bread. If you can learn how to make bread from scratch, you can learn how to be a good fill in the blank reporter, ally, or just have a literacy about some of the issues that are roiling the country.
One would think as a reporter, you should know how to ask good questions anyway. Right?
Yeah, a lot of people don't teach good questions. I watch post game, I watch interviews, and I see a lot of statements. I see a lot of just monologues. I see a lot of yes or no questions, and it's frustrating, to be honest with you. So I don't think people know how to ask good questions, and it shows.
John Sawatsky.
That's the man. I love that man.
Best,
Tell everybody who it is, John.
Best class I've ever taken.
Tell everyone who he is.
John Sawatsky is an interview guru, Canadian fellow. has this method, this system, and Google him. And I cannot watch television. Once I took his class, I snuck in 2 more times because I wanted to take his class again at work. I cannot watch interviews the same way. I just can't sit still. When someone makes a statement or asks 2 questions in a row or all that stuff, it's like, stop it.
It was one of the most memorable things I learned from the one speech class I took was don't ask a 2-part question, right? Because you never remember the first part.
No.
Writer, we might do things a little bit differently when we're writing. And frankly, I've victimized some people with my interviewing, I have to say, because I'm trying out my lead. So.
Well, I had a 7th grade science teacher who said there was no such thing as a stupid question. After 45 years in the journalism business, I might beg to differ, but I appreciate the sentiment. The same podcast I referred to, Ed Odell, the former longtime news anchor in Miami, said, and here's, I think, how white people can understand racism the best way. Black parents to not know if their child was coming home, white America doesn't understand that. And I think as a parent, you get it a little bit.
Mm.
But I think, especially given what's gone on the last few months, that spoke to me a great deal.
I waited for as long as I could for my son to drive. I blocked at every turn. I had to have an intervention. And it is to feel that the randomness of these encounters could cost you everything in the world, and there is nothing you can do. There's no totem, there's no hedge, there's no talisman, there's no standard of behavior, there's no anything that is the right mix of things when your son or daughter is going out into the world and they're doing it while Black, right? Mm-hmm. Which is why people are saying, they need help, they need allies, and they need people to do their homework to be able to see this. And keep in mind, typically what you see are only the most egregious cases, right? There's an enormous amount of things that are soul numbing before you get to somebody being shot dead. And if the only thing that registers is the death in spectacular fashion, sort of what does that say? So that's where LaChina's point about, listening, having different friends, taking these conversations a little bit more seriously and just seeming like you're interested in knowing these experiences. And then that'll deepen your reporting.
And I think the responsibility, Lonnae, and you made this point over and over again, is not just in checking yourself, but also your surroundings. And that, includes the place that you work. And I don't know how many of you right now can just close your eyes as though you're looking around the office, which I know none of us have been in the office for a while, but how many Black faces do you see? Have you ever asked why? There was a piece, and this is the graphic I talked about earlier, but it's 5 things allies can do to sponsor coworkers from underrepresented groups. Speak their name when they aren't around. Endorse them publicly. Invite them to high-profile meetings. Share their career goals with decision makers. Recommend them for stretch assignments and speaking opportunities. That's if you have Black and brown colleagues. Those are ways that you can make sure they're heard and they're elevated. But if you don't, if you're constantly walking into a room and you know that your company's job is to tell stories and there aren't faces that look like mine or Jay telling stories, but you know that we exist in the world and on the basketball court, ask why.
It's a good segue to next question. It's actually 2 questions, or actually 3, but all related. What are ways we can
we
help
just
our
have that
companies?
conversation?
I know. They're not my questions. What are ways we can help our companies attack systemic racism? I think LaChina just kind of answered that.
Yes, you did.
We do town hall meetings and various interviews, but what is the next step we can take in our industry? How can each of us on this call, how can each of us help and improve the situation in the industry across the United States?
I think we may have answered a lot of that. Ultimately, hire somebody, take a chance and nurture them. I mean, honestly, that we should nurture everyone in our newsrooms. A lot of that stuff just doesn't happen anymore. But as journalists, we can change up. We can do what we want to do. We can train better. We can talk to people better. We can approach our employees, and sometimes our employers on a more human level, and just relate to each other better. That's what it's going to take. It's very foundational. There's no magic bean that we can throw in the ground and grow the end of racism. It's very foundational stuff. People ask me all the time, so what's the secret? How'd you get to ESPN? What's the secret? Well, I could write and I could interview and I could talk. No, but it's got to be something else. Nah, bruh. You work on your foundation and you get it, you get it tight, you get it right. You do it, you repetition, and you work your way up. Now it's got to be something else. No, there's not. That's the same thing with this. It's not a magic. It's no magic trick we can do. We have to just relate to each other. We have to. If I peeled all this right now, first of all, I would bleed to death. But if all of us did that, we'd all look the same. We'd all look exactly the same if we peeled off our coverings. So if we just close our eyes and try to relate to each other as human beings first, and then open our eyes and go, oh, you're a little different. Well, tell me about that. And then grow and understand, have some empathy. That's how you do it.
Amen. Lonnae, you did a story, I think it posted yesterday on Ibram Kendi.
So what's interesting is I did that story going on 3 years ago.
Oh.
And it posted yesterday because there's so much curiosity about the foundations of racism. And in the story, Ibram Kendi says people think it's, ignorance, it's lack of knowledge, it's, lack of compassion and understanding. He says, no, you start with self-interest, cultural, economic, political. You develop a policy in service to that self-interest. The policy has a disparate effect on people, and so people point out that it's racist. And so you develop an ideology that justifies that policy, but it goes down to the self-interest. The Portuguese wanted to enslave people and the Catholic Church was protesting. So you say, no, these people are too childlike or too uncivilized. They have to be enslaved. And so that notion takes hold, but it speaks to just the hunger. What Jay was saying too, the foundations, if you're in a newsroom, you also should be in the pipeline business, right? Who's got next? And if you're not thinking about that, then you don't take the deliberate steps that you need to develop your newsroom or to develop your, reporting.
That's basically the paragraph I pulled from your story was exactly what you talked about. And it speaks to selfishness instead of selflessness, which is kind of the key to understanding people who aren't just you. All right, next question. Do big networks such as ESPN, CBS Sports, ACC Network, etc., have a bigger obligation to give their Black on-air talent more room to use their platform to advocate for change during these times? Seems like it's much needed and would do a lot of good if people such as Jay Harris, we're getting called out now, had the opportunity to dedicate segments to personal commentary opinion pieces.
Yeah, probably big networks could do more, but so could small stations. So I'm not gonna lay it all at the feet of big networks. Everyone who has a platform can do more. That's just the way it is.
Let's see. Anybody here seen Emmanuel Acho's series, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man? It's received a great deal of acclaim. What are your thoughts on this series? What are other ways we can expose ourselves to difficult situations that will allow for growth?
I think Lonnae and LaChina have said it. I mean, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
We have to put ourselves in positions to take ourselves out of it and learn and concentrate on the other person. It is not about us. I had a conversation with a friend yesterday, and we were talking about George Floyd, and he was like, he kept saying, I just can't believe it. I can never see anything like that happening. Well, it's not about you. Maybe in your experience, maybe that's true, but it's not about you because it happened. Mm-hmm. So take yourself out of it because it happens.
And it's interesting that you say that, Jay, about so statistically, 80% of police interactions are routine, right? Probably even more.
Yep.
Just like statistically, actually more police officers, there's a peril from the stresses of the job, from suicide, from, just all of these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens in terms of the danger, people getting sort of killed by the police and police officers getting killed, right? Those are
mm-hmm.
Really, really get sort of all this attention. But to your point about the guy who was like, I can't believe this is happening, even though most of the interactions are routine, my ex-husband grew up with a kid who was killed, by the police. My editor's wife's brother was killed by the police. So in our world, again, this is so much more prevalent, which is what informs that fear. In terms of the video you were talking about, Dave, I did not see it. I saw an interview about it, and there was this notion of people needing to be fed information, right? And I get that. That is that one way to do it. White folks don't know. So, this approach was, I'm here, I'm a chef, I'm going to feed them the information they need. I think that expects, in some ways, too little of white people. They don't have to be passive in this. They actually don't have to be fed, right? They don't have to be fed in any other aspect of their lives where they want to do something. And if they don't want to, it won't take hold anyway.
John Morris, would you unmute yourself? You had a question. Go ahead and ask.
Yeah, Jay, I think it's a simple question. Maybe it's a simple answer for you, but I think it could be meaningful. How do you balance what you feel personally and maybe your stance on some of these subjects with what your employer's stance would be, and knowing that you're on the air with them, you're not on the air just as an individual? How do you balance that?
In the moment, I could care less what I think, and I could care less what my employer thinks. In the moment, I am telling the story, and I'm taking the story wherever the story goes. And if I'm a journalist and I stick to the facts and I get my sources on all sides and I tell a complete story, no one can be mad at me for that.
It's good. Thank you.
Robert Eggleston, one of our NSMA board members, along with Jay Harris, and I think Jimmy Quander is on here as well. Hi, Jimmy. And Danielle Williams was on, so thank you all board members for joining. Robert, you had a question as well. Go ahead.
Dave, I wanted to go really quickly back to your your question about the uncomfortable conversations with the Black man.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily related to that, because I have a very overbearing dad and 9 brothers, so I've had a lot of uncomfortable conversations with the Black man.
Wow.
But to go back and just put a stamp on what Jay and Lonnae were talking about, I think the one thing it comes down to for me, if you want to have uncomfortable conversations, it starts with rejecting apathy. like not allowing what's happening in this world to not at least have some impact on who you are, especially when you talk about human rights. When someone is killed and it has to do with the color of their skin, or it's just wrong, be moved to read an article, be moved to ask questions. If you have people in your life of color and you hear that this is a systemic issue, be moved by what's happening. I think what we do, and yes, we're busy and we all have our own lives, but there comes a point where you have to reject that apathetic attitude that if it doesn't affect me, then it's not important. If it doesn't affect my kids, well, it is, because it affects human rights. So I think you have to move past that point of apathy and be willing to be impacted by what's happening in the world. Sorry, I didn't get that in when we were talking about it, but I just wanted to go back to it.
That's good. One of the very few things I remember from high school English was the great English poet John Donne, who said, "Every man's death diminishes me." And that was part of the poem that "For Whom the Bell Tolls" came from. And I think if you think about that way, and you have to be a caring person and understand other people and what they go through. And that's, I think, part of the maturing process is figuring out you're not the only person who stands on this earth. I think it's also, no man is an island. I think the same also John Donne. Anyway, Richard Broad, you had a question. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Dave, somehow I've lost my screen, but I'm still here. First of all, Jay, you do great work.
Thank you.
Really good. Really enjoy it.
Thank
and
you.
I want to just deal with something that you mentioned, that you have to go on about your job, and but you have this reality, and it is a reality. We can't approach this just pretending that we don't recognize someone as of color. You acknowledge that, and then you have, as you say, conversations, and we all, as journalists, have the opportunity to have these conversations. And those of us that are white can take a stand for those of different color. And that's how you approach it. Whenever I cover a match on television, and I'm a soccer commentator, I don't even know until I stop and realize, I don't know, I'm covering male athletes or female athletes, and they may be Hispanic, they may be black, they may be white. It's reality, but you don't ignore it. And the posture we have to get to is where it's not Black Lives Matter only and all lives matter only, but look at the people that are around us, and don't be colorblind, be color amazed. Because that the first diversity is what God's created, and we can bring that out if we approach it. We don't have to knock people over the head with it, but just be color amazed. It's a great world in that way, and we can amplify it in our capacity as sportscasters and sports writers.
Thank you, Richard. Good point. LaChina, I know you have to hop in a couple minutes, so I want to get this. Sean Hyken, you have a question for LaChina if you want to unmute and go ahead and ask.
Yeah. LaChina, this is for you kind of specifically as somebody who used to be an athlete. When you were, during your playing days, did you just find kind of day to day in locker rooms that you were more comfortable being interviewed by a black reporter than a white reporter? And just kind of how would you suggest that white reporters in, let's say, like a majority black locker room, let's say like the NBA, like which is what I cover, like how would you suggest that we, try to, what's like a thing that we can do like on a day-to-day basis just to kind of counter that or combat that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sean. For me, I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood, and my parents were separated at a very young age. So I bounced around a little bit and had all kinds of surroundings. My high school was very diverse, but probably predominantly black. In the 6th grade, I lived with my dad in Attleboro, Massachusetts, and I was the only black girl in the whole 6th grade. So that was quite an experience. So as an athlete, for me, I grew up really comfortable with people of all races. My next door neighbors were white, and even though we lived in a low socioeconomic neighborhood, my next door neighbors were white because all people are poor, you know what I mean? People of all colors. But so it was never an issue for me as an athlete. And clearly going to Wake Forest, I grew very accustomed to having conversations with predominantly white people all the time. So that really wasn't an issue. But in terms of covering the NBA and what you can do, I think the best thing to do is to just show athletes that you care more about them than just the points they score and the rebounds. You know, that's the biggest thing is it would be so tone deaf right now to, you know, just start talking about basketball if you had an opportunity to talk to an NBA athlete because of what's happening in the world. So I think, as Lonnae alluded to earlier, you know, you do your research from a holistic standpoint of what could be, and not that your questions will specifically go there, you know, I mean, every night's not going to be like the nights that we're seeing right now in our world. So I'm not saying that what you've read about LeBron on his Twitter or Instagram or, you know, what he's been saying in his interviews is always going to impact your line of questioning, but allow yourself to have that next level of awareness so that if it's applicable, these athletes know that you care about them as people. I think that's been one of the more frustrating things. And I understand that people have to speak up when they feel comfortable, how they feel comfortable. And I don't believe in necessarily applying pressure for people to step out and say, I'm an anti-racist. But one thing that has been just hard for me to digest is if you're going to cover sport, make sure that you are at least willing to speak on what's impacting these athletes and their everyday lives when they leave the gym, the same way that you are willing to talk about what happens between the lines when they're in the gym. Like, have the same willingness. Again, I'm not saying that you're going to decide to tell that story of what's happening off the court, but be open, be willing, be educated, so that when you do have an opportunity to share or speak up, or you are in the locker room next to that NBA player, they watch and they pay attention. And if he's been talking about Black Lives Matter for the last 10 games in a row, and you come up to him and say, hey man, you know, you had a great night on the glass tonight. You know, I mean, that athlete is going to know right away that, hey, you know, this is all about sport for you, but I'm more than that. Look at the shirts they're wearing. They say more than an athlete. Like, that's a cry to us, the media, to look at them beyond just the statistics. So I think that's the biggest thing I would say. I hope that answers your question, Sean.
No, that's great. And I had a few different stories that I've been working on over the last couple of months that are not about this at all. And so I've had to tell my editors, like, look, I feel weird about reaching out to people or reaching out to their agents, trying to talk to them about other stuff while all this is going on. So it's definitely something that I'm mindful of, but that was definitely helpful. So thanks a lot.
Awesome.
Thanks, Sean. I know you have to go too.
I
so
do.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
everyone.
much.
Just want to say thank you
touch.
for your time. Thanks, Lonnae and Jay. I mean, I'm kind of like the young, unaccomplished one in this three.
Oh, stop. Don't even stop that.
I've learned more in listening to them and definitely watching their careers over time. So it was truly an honor for me to do this. And thank you, Dave. You've been kind of supporting me in various ways. Probably, I'm not going to say you might be a booster, so I'm not going to talk about buying me lunch when I was in college.
Not a booster. Not a booster.
But you've been supporting me a lot of ways and giving me a chance to lift my voice. So I just appreciate it, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, LaChina.
Take care.
Robert Eggleston, you never got around to asking your question before, so the floor is yours.
When Lonnae pointed out that she and other people of color know two cultures, that's something that I think will really stick with me. And I've gotten to, so in recent weeks, I've asked my friends of color, you know, tell me something that's happened to you that wouldn't happen to me. And we heard that from Jay. I mean, I'm not going to knock on the door and somebody go, oh, no, the apartment I told you we had, we don't have. But I'm really curious as to the other people that are on this call that are people of color. And I would love to, I suspect they might be in a situation where they're like, oh my gosh, I'd love to tell a story. So I'd invite them to jump in.
If anybody has one, feel free, unmute and go ahead.
Grant Swin here.
Hey, Grant.
How you guys doing today?
Hey, Grant.
Good, Grant. How are you? Out in San Francisco, right?
Yes, there you go, Bay Area. But there's a story I like to tell. So as you may know, I'm a former athlete at the Academy of Art University. I'm bisexual and also I'm Black, and it's kind of, I moved all the way to San Francisco, so because I'm from the state of Georgia, and they really don't kind of play with Black bisexual athletes at all. But the thing, like back home when I was in Georgia, right before I was going to finish my last semester at the Academy of Art, I got pulled over by a police officer. I got called. Well, I was with my boyfriend at the time. Got pulled over, and some altercation happened with my boyfriend. Whatever happened, nothing. Like it's so crazy how, you know, what we see on television actually like could happen in real life. I would never have thought I would get in an altercation with a police officer, and I got called a faggot, which was awful. I don't condone that word. It's very offensive to me. But here in San Francisco is way different. It's still a lot of racism in San Francisco. Surprisingly, I coming from the East Coast, so I've tried to get a job at CVS not too long ago. Even with the COVID-19 situation was happening, they was still hiring at least 80 right around the United States. The CVS was the highest of hiring. So I went for an interview, and the guy just like was stereotyping me. I graduated, had my degree, had a good resume. It's just that, you know, stereotype, got dreads, thinking I was actually going to steal from the store. So it's like, it happens everywhere you go. In the industry with sports, I'm part of the Beyond the Headlines with Renee Washington. I don't really experience that with the industry, though. I feel like if you, like Jay said, if you stick to your story and you tell the story, I think, you know, just stick to it.
Thank you, Grant. Anybody else want to chime in? Dave Sims, I read if you're still there, I think I read a story that you had recently. Dave's still there.
I want to say something, Dave. I think it's important to listen to people, listen to Black people's stories. That's what the young man was just talking about. There is a trauma, but we have to be more than our trauma, right? And that's part of what exhausts us too. And so in sharing the load, in sharing the homework, if I've been called the N-word, then somebody called me the N-word. And so white people have stories too. And
I hate it when you read my mind.
It's a function of knowing you for so long. So go ahead and finish, Jay, because you know what I'm talking about.
I was going to ask for some stories. If anyone had any stories where they were around someone, I don't know if they're family, a coworker, they may have said something, done something, you spoke up, you didn't speak up, maybe you said something. I want to hear some stories from some white people.
And let me just say, that discomfort, everybody getting that little throat clutch, oh my gosh, that is not unlike what we are asked to do all the time, what we go through all the time, but what we have to push through. And so what we are saying is, if you want to actually do and enact and be about the things that you say you're about, there's no way around that. That is what this is. That is this discomfort. And you know, you're going to be answerable for it. You're going to be answerable to history. You're going to be answerable to your grandkids, right? They're going to ask you, what did you do in the time of COVID? What did you do in the time of the, you know, the uprising or Black Lives Matter or George Floyd, right? And so that would be the work to make peace with it. But yeah, the stories.
Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Jay, that was awful.
That was good, Jay. Thank you. And I think in sports, in a way, we're very fortunate because we get to deal with a diverse crowd.
Yes, that is true.
So I'll give you my first. So I grew up in Massachusetts, not too far from Attleboro, where LaChina lived for a year. Spent my entire life in the Northeast until I got the job doing TV sports at WXI in Winston-Salem. And I got here late September, and I want to say within a month, I go to a Winston-Salem State football game at North Carolina Central.
Whoa.
And I walk in and I look, and it's a night game. I look around. It's like, there aren't more than 3 or 4 white people in the stadium. I said, that's how it feels. And I wasn't afraid, but I felt different. And so what a great learning experience that is. And the same thing, when you're a reporter, you go to here in Winston-Salem where Route 52 kind of splits the town as a racial divide. But we would cover games at Carver High School, which is predominantly black, and in college, Winston-Salem State and A&T. But look how lucky I was. I got to cover big house games. Got to know Earl the Pearl Monroe. I mean, to me, he was one of those legends that I read about, and actually both those gentlemen. And so we're very lucky.
I love that you mentioned an HBCU too, because so much of what we're talking about is reflected in coverage of HBCUs, coverage of HBCU culture, right? You can just, it's amazing, and it informs a lot of popular culture. So just in terms of cultural literacy, but also some of the issues. The Undefeated has an HBCU vertical, right? So we cover this in depth. There's a saying that when America gets a cold, Black America catches pneumonia, right? And so if you're wondering how sports are going to be affected by the racial climate, for instance, right? If you're talking to people about why they chose to go to HBCUs, and I have an athlete son who's in this position, they have Black mamas, right? And their mamas want them to be safe. If you don't, if you aren't able to make that leap, or, if you can't find that sort of an HBCU culture, then you're missing out on part of the story. Plus, it's a really good time. All are welcome. But, revenue loss, rethinking, money games, financial disparities for HBCUs, all those, it's just a microcosm for America sort of writ large in sports.
That's HBCUs, I think, is our next Zoom discussion. A couple other of our white folks have a story, though.
I like how you said that.
Have a story, though.
Kai Dambach.
That was nice.
He's joining us from Germany.
Oh, Kai, cool.
Jawohl. But I'm speaking English. So.
All right.
It's all good. So the thing is, I'm actually in a relationship with a Brazilian woman here in Germany. And I mean, for a long time, I'd never really experienced too much racism, or I didn't really see it. But since I've started dating her, there have been some things that I've started seeing otherwise. When I took her to Washington, D.C. for the first time, we would get some eyes on us whenever we would hold each other in the metro car, and she'd be like, oh yeah, and she was like, oh yeah, look at all the eyes looking at us. And it's like, oh, but the biggest one that I experienced, we experienced, was when we flew back from Portugal, and we arrived in Berlin, and we were just walking out. It was late at night. Our flight was delayed by 3 hours, and it was frustrating. We just wanted to go home. And this officer pulls my girlfriend aside and goes, hello, what are you doing here? And he's like, well, I live here. And he's like, are you sure? Can I see your papers? And I was like, wait a sec. I was halfway out the door when I saw that she was pulled over. So then I just kind of went back and just went, I'm with her. And they went, oh, okay, on your way. It's like, really? That's it? And she went, yeah, welcome to my life. It's like, oh, okay. So I'm starting to see a few more things now in this relationship.
Thank you, Kai. Kelly Burke, would you like to unmute?
Sure, Dave. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
So I haven't seen a ton of stuff throughout my life, but I thought of one actually that just happened last week. kind of similar to what Jay shared about when he was looking for an apartment. So I live in Florida in a gated community, and we have a close-knit neighborhood, and a couple of my neighbors are Black down the street, and I'm very friendly with them. And so I was talking to one of my friends, Bonita, and her mom was in town visiting, and we were out front, and my direct neighbor was walking her dog and came back in the house. And so my neighbor, Bonita, they're getting ready to build a pool. And so she was asking me questions about our pool. And so I said, oh, well, why don't you come? She wasn't sure on something. I said, well, why don't you come look at our pool? I can show you what I'm talking about. So I took her around the side of the house, and we were back in our backyard and showing her the pool and out on the patio. And her back and her mom's back was to my neighbor's house. But I saw my neighbor that had just been walking the dog literally come out, peek her head outside of her patio lanai cage door, and just was like staring me down. And I like was kind of taken aback when it happened. Like, what is she doing? Like, why is she watching us? And they didn't see it, my neighbor Bonita and her mom, but I had to kind of think about it. The only thing I could think is that it was because they were Black, that she was out there staring like, why are they in your backyard, and why are they in the back of your house? I mean, I came back in and said to my husband, Chris, this is the weirdest thing just happened to me. And then the other situation I can think about, my husband and I have a young man that we mentored kind of all through his college career. And he's since graduated, but we consider him like our adopted son. And so we've been on trips with him. We met him last year in Asheville, North Carolina. And, we're out at different places, and people, I don't know, people were just staring constantly. Like, it was him. And then we have another young man too that we're really close with, and they're both Black. And we were, in nice resorts and restaurants, and yeah, people were just staring like it was weird that we were with them. And I don't know, I again, it's nothing blatant or overt, but I just have to think that some of it has to do with that.
Jay, you opened the floodgates. Thank you, Kelly. Sam Hyman, you have a story.
Yeah, Lonnae, you mentioned about doing stuff during quarantine, and people are going to ask that type of question down the road. My example is just a little bit different from some of the ones that have been told. Recently, I was helping a friend with a Black Lives Matter workout, and the proceeds would go to an organization, the ACLU, and we were getting a lot of good feedback from several people of different backgrounds. And I just had one person who I know personally reach out to me and say that the idea was tone deaf and a gimmick. And it put me down. And I questioned everything. I spoke to so many different people. I have still been speaking to so many different people about it. Spoke to Black coaches at the school that I work for, and they were supportive of the idea. So yeah, that's just one example that I recently encountered.
I want to say something, and thanks everybody for sharing. One of the things to understand, we're lifers. These issues are not going to go away when you all turn your gaze away, right? We're still going to be in this. We're still going to be experiencing these microaggressions. So everything that you can do to just pay closer attention and to just, follow the data on it. You don't have to have a heart for these issues, but if you just are open to the science of them and the empiricism of them and the ways that they can make your newsroom better and the ways that they can make you a better journalist and a better reporter, you can start with that. I don't care the motivation, but understand for a lot of people that you're covering, they're on the receiving end of a lot of this. And just like all of you all have a story, we have all your stories, right? They've been warehoused. Mm-hmm. So it's just something to be mindful of, and it doesn't go away for us.
Very well said. I think with that, I want to say thank you very much, Lonnae O'Neal. It was great to get to know you, and hopefully you need to be on the HBCU show we do. Whenever that
we've got better reporters for that. You need to get John X. Miller.
Oh, he would be fantastic.
Yes.
John X is awesome. I told Lonnae the story. He was our keynote speaker at our local Sports Connector Award dinner last year. Jay Harris, thank you very much as always.
You're very welcome, sir.
And
Thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody else for tuning in and participating. And as I said, this does not need to be a one-shot deal just because it's in the news now. It is something that needs to be ongoing, and you have my word, it will be on this end. So thank you very much, everybody. Go ahead, Lonnae, I can tell you.
And you have our word, Jay and I will still be black, so ongoing,
We are here for you.
and I'm here for you guys. Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend, everybody.